Listen. Can you hear it? There's something hiding in the hiss of the static, and you've arrived right on cue to catch it. I've picked up a faint signal from deep space, an outpost so off the grid I'm not sure it even has a name. Just a set of coordinates the crew won't reveal. They refer to each other by job titles and uniform colors instead of real names, as if they signed on for a mission no one's meant to know about, perhaps not even themselves. The broadcast crackles with tension, muffled shouting in the background, talk of unexplained disappearances, and a creeping sense of mistrust. No one on that station knows who or what is behind it, but the fear in their voices speaks volumes. I don't have many details, just enough to know something is stalking them from within those cramped corridors, where corporate secrecy and suspicion walk hand in hand. So, lean in with me, dear listener. Let's see what this fragile broadcast has to reveal before it's swallowed forever by the silence of space.
A siren screamed through the station, cutting the stillness like a blade. Silence was shattered in an instant, replaced by a relentless wail. The engineer knelt before an open panel, adjusting the delicate wires with precise movements. He worked carefully, aware that a single wrong move could trigger another failure. Behind him, the technician moved closer to the oxygen filter, tools clinking softly against the floor. His gloves fumbled in the low light, and the space between breaths seemed to stretch unnaturally. The air felt heavy, charged with the sense that something was about to give, and the siren kept blaring, sharp and constant, filling every corner of the room. A thin line of condensation traced the curve of the engineer's visor, catching the faint light of the control panel. He wiped it away with the back of his glove, refusing to let it distract him. No one spoke. The oxygen system was fragile, the tension in the wires tight under his fingers, barely holding together. He could feel the pressure building, the air struggling to circulate, and the faint vibration of the machinery as it tried to keep up. Behind him, something clanged, a soft metallic echo. He turned his head just enough to glimpse the technician on his knees, hands deep inside the filter. The man's breathing had quickened, but there was no time to focus on that. The system wasn't stabilizing, and the siren still screamed through the station. Nothing stayed fixed here. Every system, every piece of machinery was on borrowed time. You kept moving, kept your hands busy, checked the valves, listened to your own breath inside the helmet. You didn't stop to think what might happen if the air stopped flowing. Further back, the security officer stood, watching. Her visor shifted, following every move, every sound, but she wouldn't intervene, not unless she had to. The company allowed conversations about work, but anything personal was discouraged. The more distance, the better. The lights overhead flickered, but the engineer didn't falter, his fingers tracing the circuit paths one by one. The oxygen system was delicate, but it wasn't the only fragile thing here. They had been told before coming, focus on the system, keep your mind on the task. Don't let anything else creep in. He adjusted the valve, feeling his wrist tighten with the effort. A thin hiss escaped from the filter, and he paused, listening. The technician muttered something, exhaustion thick in his voice, but the sound was swallowed up by his suit. The security officer shifted her weight, the movement barely perceptible, and the engineer could feel her attention shift again. He ignored it. The problem was the filter. That was all that mattered. The biologist stood by the door, fingers sliding over data streams with practiced ease. She didn't flinch when the lights dimmed again, her hands moving with the same calm that felt unnervingly out of place. The station absorbed that calm just as it seemingly absorbed everything else: oxygen, energy, time. The engineer finished his adjustments, feeling the faint push of air through the system. The pressure eased, but he didn't let himself relax. Not yet. The system was still deciding whether it wanted to hold or give out. Time stretched, filled only with soft breathing and the constant hum of the station's core. He could hear his own breath inside his helmet, steady now, but still too shallow. The security officer hadn't moved. Her visor reflected the cold light of the room, her presence a reminder of the company's hold over all of them, silent, watchful, always there but never intervening unless necessary. Outside, space stretched out, vast and indifferent. Inside, the oxygen trickled through the pipes, thin and fragile. The sharp tone of an alarm suddenly sliced through the room, different from the ongoing siren, louder, more urgent. The engineer's hands froze mid-motion, fingers hovering over the wires. He recognized that sound immediately, a suit breach. The technician jerked upright from where he knelt beside the oxygen filter, his gloved hands fumbling with the tools as the alarm screamed from the display on his chest. A flashing red light pulsed against the curve of his visor, casting a strange glow across his face. The engineer turned quickly, eyes locking onto the flashing signal. "Cyan," he called out, the word heavy in the air, drowned by the technician's rising panic. The man clawed at his suit, fingers slipping against the material as he tried to locate the breach. His breathing was rapid, shallow, the sound ragged and too loud inside his helmet. The air pressure had dropped and the suit's automatic systems weren't kicking in fast enough. He gasped, pulling at the clamps on his chest, trying to force air back in. The engineer moved toward him, boots thudding softly against the floor, but there was no time. The technician's body was stiff, locked in that unnatural position, the suit straining under his hands. His breaths grew shorter, more erratic, the sound of it amplified in the silence around them. Behind, the officer tensed, her posture shifting. She was watching closely, a sense of unease creeping into her stance. They weren't supposed to intervene unless absolutely necessary, but her eyes tracked every movement as though trying to decide if this was the time. She told herself there was nothing she would be able to do to help. She wasn't a medic or a technician, but she knew, deep down, she couldn't have moved if she wanted to. "Hold on," the engineer muttered under his breath, even though he knew his crewmate couldn't hear him. His gloved hands moved fast, reaching for the emergency release, trying to patch the suit manually. The technician's legs buckled, his body swaying forward. He collapsed against the floor with a dull thud, arms splayed out awkwardly. The engineer knelt beside him, fingers working frantically, searching for the source of the breach. The siren had shifted to a higher pitch now, a steady warning that time was running out. The engineer's hands were shaking, but he forced them to move. He found the seam, a 2-centimeter gash where the suit had failed, too small to spot until it was too late. Air hissed from the suit, escaping faster now, and the technician's breaths came in shallow, ragged bursts. His visor fogged and his eyes blinked slowly, unfocused, searching for something to hold on to. The engineer pressed a patch over the breach, sealing it as quickly as he could, but it wasn't enough. He could see the shallow rise and fall of the technician's chest slowing, the breath leaving his body becoming thinner, weaker, vanishing into the vacuum around him. The room was still. Even the constant hum of the station seemed to have dimmed, as if the whole place had paused to watch. For a moment, the technician's eyes fluttered, locked onto the engineer's visor, pleading without words. But then they stopped altogether, giving way to a vacant, glassy stare. The engineer knelt beside the body, hands still pressed to the breech, his heart pounding against the silence that had returned to the room. The technician's chest was still now, the thin hiss of air barely audible as it slipped from the edges of the patch. Behind them, the security officer remained in place, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the scene. She hadn't moved an inch. The station had seemed vast when they first arrived, too vast. The corridors stretched out like veins, silent and cold, leading them deeper into the metal shell that would become their world. They walked in a line, single file, helmets on, their footsteps a soft echo in the emptiness. The engineer had been the second to step through the airlock, his hands already moving instinctively to the tools on the belt of his blue spacesuit. The mission brief had been clear: assess, maintain, repair. He had been sent here to fix things. But now, standing in the entry bay, the enormity of it hit him in a way the briefing hadn't captured. The walls seemed to close in, pressing the air thin. He turned to look at the others. They were all there, helmets glinting in the sterile light, and yet there was already a distance between them. No one spoke. They could, of course. Comms were open, but the company had made it clear, stay focused. The silence wasn't enforced, but it was encouraged. Personal exchanges only served to distract from the task at hand. And so they kept their eyes forward, following the security officer's lead as she guided them toward their designated sections. The technician lingered behind, his gaze fixed on the long stretch of corridor that led to the oxygen bay. He had been briefed on the systems he would be handling, critical, delicate, and in constant need of monitoring. His cyan-gloved hand tightened on the handle of his toolkit as he imagined the intricate filters, the fragile tubing that would soon be under his care. He had wanted this, had applied for the mission with the eagerness of someone trying to prove something. Now, in the cold glow of the station's lights, he felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. The chief of security walked ahead, back straight, movements deliberate. Her orders were simple: oversee, report, intervene only if necessary. She had been the last to board the shuttle that brought them here, and from the moment they left Earth her presence had been constant, watchful. There was no doubt in her step as she led them through the steel corridors. She knew the protocols by heart, knew the rules the company had put in place. Follow procedure, complete the mission. The biologist had kept to herself, already absorbed in the data she was reading from her tablet. She was efficient, almost mechanical, in the way she worked. She didn't look up as they passed through the various sections of the station, her fingers gliding over the screen as though the walls around her didn't exist. The engineer glanced at her as they moved, but she didn't acknowledge him. She was too focused on the numbers, on the task. He returned his attention to the path ahead, feeling the familiar pull of isolation creeping into the spaces between them. They had signed up for this, after all, knew what it meant to be part of something so far from everything else. They were there to work, not to talk. They were professionals, chosen for their ability to function under the company's watchful eye, chosen for their propensity to keep themselves to themselves. As they reached the central hub, the security officer slowed, gesturing silently to the individual workstations. It was the only time she spoke on that first day. "You know your sections. Keep to them." The engineer had taken his place in the maintenance bay, fingers brushing the cold steel of the control panels. He could see the fine details of the wiring, the way the station had been constructed with such precision. It was beautiful in a way, a fragile beauty, stitched together by careful hands. But it was a beauty that didn't allow for mistakes. In the days that followed, the silence settled deeper. They worked in separate rooms and communicated only through brief clipped reports. The company had trained them well. Keep your focus, keep the station running. And for a while, that was enough. The hiss of escaping air was the only sound now, soft but constant, like the station itself was exhaling. The engineer's hands worked steadily over the control panel, movements mechanical, precise, though his mind was somewhere else, locked in the image of the technician's crumpled form. He hadn't even looked back at the body. Not yet. Behind him, the security officer remained motionless. Her visor reflected the faint, cold light of the room, but her presence felt heavier than ever now. Her role had always been to watch, to report if necessary. But in this moment she was as still and silent as the station itself. The engineer swallowed hard, trying to shake the weight pressing against his chest. The technician's breathless body was just out of sight, but he felt it, like a shadow in the room that wouldn't leave. He focused on the valve beneath his hand, adjusting the flow with a delicate touch, recalibrating the system. The pressure gauge flickered, and for a moment it looked like the oxygen flow was holding, but the numbers hovered just shy of safety, wavering between life and death. He couldn't afford to let the frustration show. Not here. Not now. The biologist stood by the door, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the data screen in front of her. She didn't flinch when the lights flickered overhead, her focus unwavering. She was always calm, detached. But here it felt unnerving. She hadn't spoken since the technician's death, and the silence between them all hung like a cold mist. Another adjustment. Another faint hiss. The air was thick, heavier than before. The engineer could feel it in the way his breaths came slower, deeper. The oxygen was flowing, but it wasn't enough to wash away the tension still creeping under his skin. He glanced at the gauge again, watching it flicker between hope and collapse. He wiped his glove across his visor, clearing the condensation that blurred his vision, then tightened his grip on the final valve. He couldn't let this fail. Not now. Not when everything was hanging on the thin, fragile line between breathing and suffocating. The security officer finally moved, a single step forward. She didn't speak, but her presence drew his attention like gravity. The engineer didn't look up. His focus was on the system, on the numbers, on the delicate balance he was trying to hold together. He couldn't afford to meet her gaze. The biologist's fingers hovered over her data screen, tracing the slow flow of information as though it held all the answers. She was always like that, silent, methodical, as if the cold logic of numbers could explain the thin air they were breathing, the cracks in the system, the body lying still behind them. The gauge clicked again, and the engineer felt the air shift, just enough to notice. The oxygen was flowing, not perfectly, but enough to keep them going. He allowed himself the smallest exhale. The pressure had stabilized, at least for now. The officer took another step forward, finally acknowledging the man on the floor. Her visor turned slightly, reflecting the still figure. No one spoke. The station hummed around them indifferent, while outside, space pressed in, silent and vast. The engineer straightened, his gaze falling back to the panel. The lights flickered overhead, casting brief shadows against the walls before steadying again. The system was finally stable, but he couldn't shake the impression it wouldn't hold forever, and perhaps not even very long at all. The security officer had been the first to step onto the station, boots echoing off the steel deck, her posture rigid, every movement deliberate. She was already in full gear, her black uniform immaculate, eyes sharp as she scanned the corridors. The others laughed as they stowed their helmets, chatting about the smooth flight in, the excitement of finally being aboard. But she wasn't joining in, not yet. Her eyes surveyed the empty corridor before them, fingers flexing at her side. The station, though well lit, hummed with a mechanical coldness she couldn't shake. Something about the way the lights buzzed overhead, the dull murmur of machinery in the walls, it all felt too clinical, too perfect, as if the whole scene had been waiting for them. She doubted anyone else noticed. They were too busy acclimating, marveling at their new home away from home, already talking about the work ahead, the excitement of the mission. But to her, the silence beyond their voices seemed to stretch unnaturally long, too quiet, as if the station itself was listening. She walked several paces ahead of the rest, scanning doorways, checking every shadow. There weren't supposed to be shadows. This place was designed for efficiency, lighting in every corridor. But still, the corners seemed darker than they should be. She took note of the way the vents angled overhead, wide enough for someone to crawl through. She imagined what it might take to bypass the security systems here, what tools she would need to dismantle the locks. It wasn't just a thought exercise, it was instinct. The engineer had been laughing with the pilot behind her, their easy banter filling the sterile space. The commander kept a professional tone, but even he was relaxed. The others couldn't feel it, that subtle wrongness beneath the surface. Maybe that's why she was here, to sense what they didn't. At the first door they came to, the others hesitated, waiting for clearance. The engineer made a joke about not wanting to be the one to break in, but she was already stepping forward, swiping the access panel, her expression unreadable as the door slid open without a sound. It unsettled her how quiet it was. The air inside was too still, As they entered the main corridor, she let her hand rest near the sidearm at her hip, a gesture that had already become muscle memory after years of military life. The weapon wasn't necessary here, or so they told her, but that hadn't stopped her from running system diagnostics the moment she had landed. She'd tested every alert, mapped out the routes in her head, escape hatches, emergency exits, places where a person could hide. The others had busied themselves unpacking, orienting themselves with their workstations while she had run a silent sweep of the perimeter. They hadn't noticed her absence. Why would they? No one thought there was anything to worry about yet. The station was new, meticulously planned and fully equipped. At least that's what the company had promised. But her instincts told her otherwise. She could see the flaws in the layout, the vulnerabilities. She'd been around long enough to know that promises didn't mean much in a place like this. Overthinking it already? The biologist had caught her watching the doorway a little too long, her tone light, teasing. She hadn't meant any harm by it, but it only irritated the officer. She shook her head, a small, tight smile barely visible through the reflection in her visor. "Just doing my job," she said, voice clipped. But inside she was already cataloging every possible security risk. The corridors, the airlocks, the storage rooms, each one a potential point of failure. The others wouldn't see it, not yet. They were too eager, too trusting of the company's assurances. They moved deeper into the station, the low hum of the life support system a constant companion. Every few minutes she would glance back, her eyes darting between the bulkheads and corners, as if something could slip through the cracks if she didn't keep watch. She had learned long ago not to trust silence. When they reached the central hub, the others had dispersed, moving toward their stations, plugging into the routines they had been trained for. The pilot and specialist were laughing again, something about their bunks. The engineer had already buried himself in the engine reports, oblivious to everything but his systems. They weren't wrong for feeling at ease. It was what they had been trained to do, after all. But she couldn't shake the sensation creeping up her spine. She lingered near one of the consoles, her fingers tracing the edges of the screen. It displayed a stream of code, diagnostics running smoothly. No errors, no threats. But she didn't trust it. The station systems were designed to run for months without human interference, and yet, the hairs on the back of her neck refused to lie flat. Later that evening, after everyone had settled into their routines, she found herself in the security room alone. It wasn't an official duty shift, just her going over the monitors, running checks that didn't need running. A quiet hum filled the room, and the glow from the screens cast an eerie light across her face. The others would have called it paranoia, over-preparedness. But vigilance had kept her alive in worse places than this. She keyed through the station's surveillance systems, her eyes scanning the halls she had walked earlier. Nothing. Just the empty, sterile passageways she already knew by heart. Yet still, she couldn't relax, couldn't ignore that creeping feeling that had settled deep in her bones the moment they had arrived. In those early days, no one had shared her unease. The technician joked about her stiff shoulders, how she looked like she was ready for a fight. The pilot had laughed and said she'd get used to it. Maybe they were right, she thought. Maybe the silence was just that. Silence. But as she sat in that dimly lit room staring at the feed, her gut told her otherwise. The engineer's fingers lingered over the panel, feeling the low hum of the circuits beneath his gloves. But the vibration didn't soothe him. The air was moving again, slowly pushing through the system's veins, but it was sparse, thin like the space between breaths, fragile like the body lying motionless behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The room had grown colder since the technician died, colder even as the oxygen flowed. The weight of his suit pressed down with each shallow inhale. This wasn't supposed to happen. The failures were constant, yes, but they were small, routine even, easy to patch up, easy to ignore. Until now. The engineer adjusted the final valve, his movements slow, deliberate. He couldn't afford another mistake. The filter hissed softly as the air slid through, but the sound only deepened the silence. It pressed in on him, filled the spaces between his thoughts, settled behind his ribs. He tried to focus on the task, on the wires still tangled in his hands, but the pull of guilt was too strong. He should have seen it, the warning signs, the slight flicker in the system's pulse. The technician had been right there, working beside him, breathing beside him, and now that space was empty, gone, just like that. The engineer wiped at the condensation gathering on his now open visor. His chest tightened with each slow exhale. The air around him thinned despite the systems telling him it was stable. It wasn't just the station. He could feel it in the wires too, in the way they seemed to tug at his hands, in the way the pressure shifted under his fingers. The system was holding, barely, but it felt frail. They were all fragile now, as delicate as the thin atmosphere that had almost slipped away from them. And yet they worked on. He kept his hands moving because that's what they were supposed to do. Fix what could be fixed, move on, not look back. But the image stayed with him, the sight of the technician crumpling like the station had reached out and taken him. He could feel the security officer watching from across the room, studying him. It was distant, impersonal. They all were now. Just bodies in suits, keeping the station alive, while something inside it pulled at the seams, unraveling them one breath at a time. The lights flickered again, their faint buzz barely breaking through the cold silence of the room. The biologist stood by the door, her hands frozen above the console, data streams forgotten. She hadn't moved since the technician had crumpled to the floor, the sounds of his gasping breath still echoing faintly in her mind. But it wasn't the sight of his body that kept her attention now. It was something else, something deeper. Her gaze shifted slowly, almost unwillingly, to where the technician's form lay still on the floor, the red warning light on his suit no longer flashing. The silence around his body was suffocating. It pressed in on her tight and cold, and for the first time since they'd boarded the station she felt it, something out of place. The sterile air around her seemed thinner now, as if it had to work harder to reach her lungs. A creeping sensation, like a whisper just out of reach, began to wind its way through her thoughts. The technician wasn't just dead. The station had taken him. She could feel it. In the walls. In the floor beneath her boots. The low hum of the station's systems, once comforting in their reliability, now felt wrong. There was something beneath it, something she hadn't noticed before. The biologist swallowed, her throat dry, and tried to push the thought away, tried to refocus on the numbers, the data. But the console screen seemed blurred, distant, as if her connection to the cold logic she clung to had started to fray. She took a step toward the body, her footfall muffled by the rubberized flooring, and crouched just slightly, her eyes narrowing on the suit breach that had ended his life. It was too small, too precise. Her heart began to beat faster, though her face remained still, composed in a way she'd trained herself to maintain. But inside, something shifted. An instinct she had ignored when they first arrived, suppressed under layers of procedure and protocol, had begun to claw its way to the surface. Something about the station wasn't right. The thought was as dangerous as it was undeniable. She stared at the technician's helmet, at the frozen expression behind the fogged visor, and felt the familiar grip of isolation tighten around her. The station had been their task, their mission, but now it felt like something else. Her hand twitched, ready to signal the security officer or the engineer. But she hesitated. What would she say? How could she explain this feeling, this creeping dread, when the data told her nothing was wrong? The biologist took a slow breath, forcing herself to stand. She had no proof, just some nebulous gut feeling. The tools were gathered in silence, each of them moving with the weight of a task completed but far from resolved. The engineer was the first to rise, his gloved hands tightening around his toolkit, fingers brushing the edges as though the familiar feel of the tools could ground him. The technician's body remained on the floor, still and untouched. The red light on his suit had faded, no longer flashing its urgent warning, but the echo of that light seemed to linger, like a pulse in the air that refused to die. No one said a word. There was nothing left to say. The security officer gestured to the door, her movements sharp, precise. She didn't look at the body, didn't even glance toward it as they filed out of the room one by one. The engineer followed, his steps heavy, as though each footfall carried the weight of something he didn't want to admit. Behind him, the biologist trailed, her gaze fixed ahead, fingers still wrapped around the edge of her tablet, though she hadn't touched the screen in minutes. The door slid shut behind them with a soft hiss, sealing the dead man's body inside, alone. A corridor stretched out before them, dimly lit, the walls pressing in on all sides. The silence was heavy now, heavier than it had been inside the oxygen room, as though the air itself was thick with the tension they carried. The hum of the station's systems vibrated beneath their feet, a constant reminder of how fragile everything was here, and how fine a line they trod. The lights overhead flickered, casting brief shadows that danced along the walls before the dim glow returned, steady but weak. The corridor seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly ahead, and for a moment none of them could quite shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that the station was watching, waiting. The engineer's gaze fixed on the path ahead, but his mind lingered in the oxygen room behind them. On the way, the technician had fallen, on the cold mechanical indifference of the systems he'd tried so hard to fix, and the black-suited sentry who scrutinized their every move. The air still felt charged by something unseen, as if the station had taken more than just the technician's breath. No one spoke. They could have, maybe should have, but the silence between them had grown too thick, too impenetrable. Words would only draw attention to what they couldn't face. The security officer walked ahead, her pace unhurried, her posture rigid. She hadn't looked back once. She wouldn't. Protocol dictated they leave the body behind until retrieval could be arranged. The technician's death had been an accident, nothing more, nothing less, but the others felt it. The weight of his absence hung over them, a presence in the air that refused to fade. The biologist, her face hidden in the shadow of her pink helmet, kept her hands close to her sides, her eyes flicking briefly to the side as they passed each junction. The station seemed different now. The corridors, once cold but reliable, felt hostile, as though the walls themselves were closing in, inch by inch. She forced herself to focus on the task ahead, on the data she would need to review, but the thought kept returning, unbidden. The technician had died too easily. They walked in a line, shadows cast by the weak lighting, and the drone of the station filled the space between them. But it wasn't enough to drown out this new, oppressive silence, a weight that clung to their suits, to their skin, to the very air they breathed. It felt as though the station itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. As they moved down the corridor, the engineer's gaze drifted to a small viewport set into the wall, the glass thick with layers of dust and time. For a moment his hands stopped their mechanical movements, fingers tightening around the edge of his toolkit. He stepped closer to the window, almost without thinking, his eyes drawn to the void beyond. Space stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. It was vast in a way that made his chest tighten, as though the air around him had vanished again. The stars, distant, cold, burned in the blackness, but they didn't offer warmth or comfort. They were far away, unreachable, and the station felt like nothing more than a tiny fragment caught between them, adrift in the silence. He stared for a moment longer, feeling the pull of it, the emptiness, the nothingness that stretched forever. There was no up or down, no horizon to cling to, just the infinite expanse of dark. It felt as though the station wasn't tethered to anything at all, just floating there, alone, as if the universe itself had forgotten they existed. The others continued on, their footsteps faint echoes in the narrow corridor, but the engineer remained for a second longer, his breath misting the glass. The station's faint pulse was swallowed by the void beyond the window, and he could almost imagine the silence out there, the absolute quiet that would consume them if the station faltered again. He pressed his gloved hand against the glass, the cold seeping through the layers of material. There was something terrifying about it. Space. It didn't care if they lived or died. It simply was, unchanging, unyielding. They were small, insignificant, and the station was all that stood between them and the endless abyss. The darkness beyond the stars felt alive somehow, shifting in ways he couldn't understand. The weight of it settled into his bones, a reminder that no matter how advanced their systems were, no matter how carefully they worked to maintain the fragile balance of air and pressure, this inky void was always there, waiting. He pulled his hand back from the window, feeling the disconnect more acutely than before. In here, they worked to keep things running, to survive. Out there, the universe moved on, indifferent to their struggle. The engineer let out a slow breath, fogging the glass again, then turned away, forcing himself back into the motion of the station. But the image stayed with him, space, endless and empty, pressing in on them from all sides. The central hub had once felt like the closest thing to a home here, a place where they could regroup, gather their thoughts, check their data. But now, as the crew stepped into the dimly lit chamber, it felt different. The familiar thrum of machinery that had always been a background comfort seemed colder, sharper. The walls, once just functional steel, now felt oppressive, the sharp angles of the metal enclosing them like a cage. The engineer's eyes swept across the space, taking in the flickering lights overhead, the control panels lining the walls. Everything was the same, but something had shifted. The metallic scent of the station filled his lungs, tinged with the cold sterility that suddenly seemed too much, as if the walls themselves were suffocating them, millimeter by millimeter. No one spoke. The silence was louder now, more noticeable, as if the very air between them had grown hostile. The space they had worked in for weeks, the systems they had maintained with careful precision, now seemed alien. The subsonic hum of the machines no longer reassured them. It echoed in the hollow spaces between the walls, vibrating in their bones like something waiting to break free. The biologist hovered near her console, her eyes moving across the screens, but her usual focus was gone. Her fingers twitched over the keys, hesitant, as though even the data streams had turned against them. She glanced at the others, the tension flickering across her face before she looked away, back to the cold glow of her monitor. The security officer stood by the central controls, posture rigid, polished helmet reflecting the dim light, but she too seemed smaller, less certain. The cold indifference she carried had cracked, replaced by something more human, wariness, unease. She shifted her weight, her fingers brushing the edge of the console, but it was a gesture more for reassurance than control. The engineer felt it too, the way the station had changed, or perhaps the way they had changed within it. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a machine, massive and uncaring, and they were trapped inside it. Every hiss of air through the vents, every mechanical click, felt like a reminder of how fragile their survival truly was. He glanced at the technician's empty station, the tools still scattered across the surface where they had left them before the oxygen system failure. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had closed in just slightly, enough to make the space feel less like a place to work and more like a prison. His fingers tightened around the straps of his toolkit, the weight of it suddenly more noticeable. The station had once been their lifeline. Now it felt like a labyrinth with no exit. Every step they took felt like it was being monitored, every sound like it was being absorbed by something deeper within the walls. The cold metallic air wrapped around them, pressing down, filling the spaces in between, and for the first time, the station felt like it was alive.
So that's where our reception breaks up. The station's comms garbled, a lifeline cut short. One crew member, Cyan, deceased, the station's systems failing by the minute, and the rest of them slipping into the jaws of suspicion. They won't share their real names with each other, but paranoia seems to bind them tighter than any corporate contract ever did. And if you're wondering how it got this dire so quickly, well, you're not alone. We've only picked up fragments, but each clue hints at a larger puzzle behind that corporation, those color-coded uniforms, and the silent threat creeping amongst the shadows. For now, the signal has died out. Maybe it's just interference, or maybe someone on board killed the feed. Either way, I'm not giving up. I'll keep sifting through the static to see if they break radio silence again. If and when they do, we'll listen together. Because in the void of space, nothing stays secret for long.